This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, an independent center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israeli democracy. If you're like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find all about it on our homepage. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dahlia Scheindlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that we find fascinating and important. Our guest today is Dr. Tehilla Shwartz Altshuler. She is a senior fellow at the Center for Democratic Values and Institutions, the head of the Media Reform Program and the Open Government Program at the Israel Democracy Institute. She's also a board member of Israel's National Press Council and a lecturer at the Hebrew University. I could go on and on, but we'll stop here. We'll be talking about your recent articles regarding the current debate over the press and politics in Israel, maybe touch on some privacy stuff. Dr. Tehilla Shwartz Altshuler, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So you write on a wide range of issues in general, but specifically with relation to the health and independence of the press in Israel today. Do we have a strong press in Israel? Do we have a free press? Before we start talking about the threats and the problems, what's good about the Israeli press? Do we do a good job?
I think so. The Israeli press is quite vivid, and Israelis are very enthusiastic media consumers, and we love to talk about media on social media as well. Each one of us is a great media critic, and therefore I think we can talk about generally a free press. We do have some threats. One of them is the fact that the Israeli media market is a very small one. Others is the interconnections between politics and the press, or between, I would say, ownership and rich people and politics and the media. And another thing, obviously, is the fact that we are under security threats, and therefore we have military censorship and gag orders in Israel in an extent that you can't really find in other democracies.
But if the Israeli press has withstood these challenges and problems for so many years and has remained, after 70 years, a vivid press, as you say, maybe those challenges aren't that imposing as you may think.
I think we need to talk about two things. First of all is that the relationship between politics and the press, it has been there all along the history of the country, but it has become more severe during the past, I would say, decade or a decade and a half. It's not a coincidence that all the charges that our Prime Minister Netanyahu is actually facing has to do something with the media. That's the first thing. The other thing is something that you may have heard about, which is called the internet, which have kind of disrupted the media business model. And here again, when you have a very, very delicate market, a small market, it is, I would say, other things or other phenomena that you would see in other countries are being accelerated here because the market is so small.
Okay, but those are things, like, as you point out, that are happening in other countries as well, the changing of the media model because of the internet. I think all of Western press, and probably not just Western, is suffering from this. Can you tell us something about what has been happening in public broadcasting here that reflects some of this tension between politics and press? I think that's an interesting case that I'd like to, sort of understand from beginning to end, or in an orderly way from you.
Okay, so let's look back a couple of decades ago where the Israeli public broadcasting was actually initiated and founded. I think we looked at our big mother, which is the BBC. We really wanted to imitate what we saw there. Unfortunately, I think the political culture in Israel kind of made it difficult. The public broadcasting in Israel has become very political. Therefore, the management was not good. There was a lot of corruption, and it actually did not fulfill the job that it was supposed to have. First of all, by being a strong investigative journalism body, but also by being the biggest production house for original Israeli production. Those two things were not being done, and it cost the Israeli taxpayer about 1 billion shekels a year, which was really a waste of money. It took about 25 years and about a dozen public committees to get to the conclusion that this should be stopped, and we should close the current body and reopen it, a new one everyone under different management, under different conditions. That was something which was really unique in Israel in terms of the ability to actually materialize a huge reform. It had to do with firing lots of journalists and other workers. It had to do with reopening management positions. This happened around 2014. By 2015, the new Israeli Public Corporation, which is called Kan, which stands for here, actually started working. But here again, all of a sudden, some of our politicians thought that this new body would be too strong of a body, too critical, too independent. And then came all the regrets. It was really unbelievable to see.
So we're saying we spent 25 years trying to make reforms, but now we're not too sure.
But only a couple of years to destroy it. But why do we need such a strong public broadcaster? Why can't we rely on the commercial broadcasters and investing money in original productions or in investigations via, I don't know, some sort of like the cinema fund or other governmental branches?
And that's a great question, but just don't forget to tell us the rest of the story about what happened with the news corporation.
Of course, because we need to talk about the Eurovision. The end of it is going to be the Eurovision.
We actually planned
this
whole podcast just so we could talk about
because I'm not your toy guy. So the truth is that the question of the necessity of public broadcasting in Israel is a very strong one, just as much as we can ask the same question in other European countries. I think the answer has to do with the word ecosystem. In a small market, you can't expect that the private market would supply everything that you need. Why? Because when you have a media outlet that is being controlled by, let's say, businessmen who are willing to pour money, usually to lose money on such an outlet, they want to uplift their investment into, let's say, political power or strengthening their other interests. Therefore, you can't expect the private market to supply sometimes investigative journalism pieces which are strong enough, I would say, being critical about the private market. On the other hand, obviously, public broadcasting could do just this job. So if we talk about an ecosystem, the idea behind that is that each one of the segments of the market would uplift or would help the others function better.
Or be critical of the others.
Exactly. So our disaster was the fact that our public broadcaster was so bad that it kind of helped everyone go down the hill and not uphill. I think that the potential in the new body is huge, but still the burden of proof is definitely on them.
But is it all down to political will by the powers that be? I mean, let's spell it out. If the Prime Minister wants it to function, it will, and if it doesn't, it won't.
I mean, I think we have to explain for our listeners what kind of hurdles and challenges and obstacles have been placed before the new news corporation. It wasn't just that they came into existence and everything was fine.
No, I think the most important thing is that the legislation itself was good legislation. It made enough barriers between political power and the actual management
was approved by ministerial panels, by politicians themselves. It didn't just come out of nowhere. I mean, the same politicians did approve the whole process.
Yes, but so sometimes miracles happen, which is interesting because we see the regrets about a year later. They actually rethought or were thinking again about this process, and they said to themselves, oh my God, what is this corporation worth if we can't control it?
And they actually said those words.
Yeah.
Exactly. Those are the words of Minister of Culture Affairs, Miri Regev.
Were her actual words, why should we fund it if we can't control it? No, it wasn't really about giving the budget to it. Why should we give? I mean, maybe the words were that, but wasn't the idea that we're paying for it? Shouldn't we be able to control it?
So define we. When you talk about we, the question is whether they represent the general public or their own, I would say, very narrow interests. And in this sense, I don't think it's only budgeting. It's controlling positions. It's deciding who is going to be the board of members, what journalists are going to be hired by the new corporation. And I think one of the things that the corporation tried to do from square one was to really show off a very pluralistic team of journalists. They took people from the ultra-Orthodox community, from the Arab community, from the right and from the left, and I think it's much more pluralistic than the former body, which is a blessing. On the other hand, along the way, what we could see during the past couple of, let's say, 2-3 years, is really the regrets, the political regrets. So first of all, they postponed as much as they could the real opening of this corporation. And then when the Supreme Court kind of forced them to open it up, they passed legislation to split the new. Think about it. It hasn't even opened up yet, to split the new body into two little bodies. As we say, not one dog, but two little puppies. And one which would deal with drama and entertainment, and the other one that would deal with news. It was so funny because those two bodies, according to the new legislation, were identical in terms of their management, appointments, budgeting. Everything was identical except that they were two. Now, this legislation is now under review at the Supreme Court. So the funny thing is that once Israel has won the Eurovision contest, and please God, next year in Jerusalem, inshallah, the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, has announced that if Israel doesn't have a strong, including news and current affairs issue body, the Eurovision will not be in Jerusalem. So all of a sudden, the Minister of Communications, Ayub Kara, has sent a letter to the Supreme Court that he would stop defending this legislation under the Supreme Court, and it is all in order to save the Eurovision context and bring
works.
it to Jerusalem.
But
no, it shows something so annoying, which is the fact that it's always the non-material or the I would say, core issues that win.
Yeah. But what were they trying to achieve by splitting the body into two little bodies? I mean, does size matter in this case?
Absolutely, yes. Size means more budget, size means more power, size means more ability to stand in front of political pressure. But one has to admit that this is not the only media outlet. We can see political pressure becoming much more intensified during the past couple of years, especially after the elections of 2015. If we want us just to get back just for a short while to 1996. At 1996, Netanyahu wins the elections for the first time. At that night, I think he realizes something very important. He has won the elections against the will of Israeli media. Israeli media has some kind of a prior fixation against Netanyahu, and Netanyahu understands.
So it's not just in his head.
Of course not. You can see it very, I think, precisely. The question is whether it has any kind of reason. But obviously, Israeli journalists, Israeli press don't like Netanyahu.
Well, why do you think? I mean, is it a pre-existing bias, or do they not like him because they think he's a bad politician, a corrupt politician, a disingenuous? I mean, is there a substantive reason why they're critical of him, or they just, as he would claim, just hate him for no reason and wish him ill?
I think, first of all, that media in its DNA is more liberal, so they don't like right-wing politicians. That's the first.
We've had right-wing leaders in this country before Netanyahu.
Yes, we had. I'm just saying, I think it has to do a little bit with that. It has to do with his American character as well. Israelis don't like it all the time. I mean, he seemed a little bit too, I would say, plastic. Polished, yeah. So that's another thing. Also think about the trauma of the assassination of Prime Minister
Rabin. 1996, he was still partly blamed for that.
Exactly, he was partially blamed for that. So I think we can talk about a mixture of reasons, which all come to that night when Netanyahu realized that if he wants to continue being elected, he needs to rethink what he thought about Israeli media. And the first thing he needs is to have his own media outlet, a media outlet that would support him personally. It took about a decade, and then Israel Hayom, Israel Today, was founded.
But you think that was his obsession for 10 years between 1996 and 2006, that he was waiting to find the way
I think
to do
so.
this?
And I think Netanyahu wanted another thing, which also is something that we need to point out. Netanyahu wanted to take the Israeli media out of the closet. He wanted to open to the public about the hidden interests behind the objectivity curtain tradition that Israeli media was so proud of. And I think the biggest thing that Israel Hayom as a newspaper actually created or donated to Israeli media market was the fact that from day one, they started telling their readers, here is what you wouldn't read in Yediot Achronot or in other competing media outlets, and let us tell you why. Now, this agenda or this tactics kind of shake the whole media market because it forced other media outlets who usually and traditionally never ever referred to their competitors. It forced them to start talking about their competitors. And today, let's say 15 years later, in Israeli media, you can read in the Marker what Globes didn't do well yesterday and why. This is something that kind of was really bad on the one hand because it is the main reason for lowering public trust in the media. When you know a little bit more about the behind the scenes of an institution, you trust it less.
Because you see all the self-interest behind it, and that's probably true.
Exactly.
But it also contributed to the polarization of the media in Israel to a great extent.
I'm not sure if polarization would be the best term because it added pluralism to the market, because today you have a very, very strong and major newspaper, which is a right-wing newspaper, Israel Hayom. Except that my claim usually was that this is not a right-wing newspaper. It is a newspaper that supports one political prime minister personally. And let's think about, a scenario where tomorrow Netanyahu is being faced with criminal charges.
Just hypothetically.
Yeah, and he's going to do what his predecessor, Ariel Sharon, did.
Die?
No, but start disengagement process. Think about that.
You really? Just like the movie Norman. Yeah. Do you think it's going to be like that?
I think Norman is a great movie. My brother is one of the
actors
in the movie.
Okay, so I think it was a great movie too.
My brother is Ozzy Schwartz. He plays actually himself. He's the cantor in the movie.
That's a great character.
Your brother? Oh, I know. Oh.
Now, we could get in trouble for saying that's a good movie because that movie caused a lot of controversy. But what you're saying is that there's some truth to that movie in some ways.
Yeah, and also think about the fact that in a scenario where Netanyahu is being faced with criminal charges and he wants to create another disengagement, what would Israel Hayom do? This is the question. Is it a right-wing newspaper that would object such a process, or does it support Netanyahu personally so that any decision Netanyahu decides would actually get support?
But that's exactly what I'm saying about the polarization as opposed to pluralism, because if this specific newspaper is purely and blatantly agenda-driven, and it creates a ripple effect to the other media outlets in Israel that are also to stay in the race become themselves purely and blatantly agenda-driven. The news, the public debate, the very essence of the forum of public debate that we want the media to be disappears.
I don't know, Gilad. Don't you think you're exaggerating the extent to which any media outlet, even in this wonderful, enlightened, post-war environment where we think we have independent, objective media, hasn't it always been a bit of a fiction?
Of course.
We're not in the era where newspapers are party arms directly, but we all know the leanings of all the newspapers we read, and we do in the States and we do in Israel.
Sure, but there's a difference between admitting that and trying to minimize the adverse effects of that and, putting it on a pedestal.
So I think what happened in the Israeli media during, let's say, the past 15 years is this being embarked from the closet. Because I think that even my mother today would admit that what she reads in the paper is not as true as the Bible or as traffic signs. People do understand, or
she thinks the Bible's more true?
I don't know. Okay. Well, let's ask her.
No, I'm trying to understand. Okay.
But I think in this sense that the media literacy of the general public kind of went high, together with the fact that public trust in the media went low. And it should be like that.
Yeah, it's healthy on some level, right?
Absolutely, I agree. I think it's healthy, and I think that transparency needs to be the new objectivity.
I like it. Transparency is the new objectivity. You heard it here first.
Up myself.
But what do you do about the public trust in the media? That is really detrimental to democracy, isn't it?
Why? We're saying that it's a healthy thing. Do you disagree with us?
No, but isn't it?
We should see it in both ways. First of all, absolutely, the media is the cement that kind of glues the stones or the bricks of democracy together. Without mediating reality, messages and everything, you don't really have a functioning democracy. This is something we need to be very aware of. That's why when public trust in the media goes too low, so it is a danger to democracy. On the other hand, if it kind of reflects a healthy process where people understand a little bit more how the media functions and what's behind the scenes and what are the interests behind it, that could be quite a healthy process. Now, the interesting thing is that both at the U.S. and in Israel, we see a major decline of public trust, and this decline kind of stopped at 2016, and then by 2017, we see a beginning of a rise of public trust. And the question, I think what I'm asking myself is, why is that? So first of all, if we read literature about transparency in other institutions as well, we see this kind of a graph where at first, when a public institution is going through, let's say, a transparency process, at the beginning, public trust declines. Because we see corruption, we see stupidity. We see inefficiency. We see all those phenomena when a closed institution becomes a little bit more open. But then, in the long term, public trust actually rises. And this is why we're such advocates of transparency, because otherwise we would have said, let's not have transparency to begin with. And I think the same thing happens to the media, both here and in America. Also, we need to remember that we are swamped with information from social media, from the internet, from traditional media outlets, from so many places. We need someone that we trust to give us some context, to just make some order in everything that is going on around us. And for that, we need to get back to traditional media.
But
we need an editor, someone who would choose for us what we're going to see on the front page. And this is something that both Netanyahu and Trump had tried, I would say, to cut public trust in. This is something that social media has said no need anymore. And all of a sudden, after a decade, we see that we do need someone to sort it out for us.
So the future to journalism after all, Dahlia. Who would have thought?
I mean, I would have thought, but I'm not saying that I'm so prescient. I'm just thinking this through. As you're saying, so people, first of all, see all the warts exposed and they kind of get disgusted, but then they say, well, it ain't pretty, but it's the only thing we have in terms of helping us really make sense of the world. Do you think that carries over into other forces that involve the health of democracy, so that people might say, on the one hand, Israel has seen some illiberal trends, not only in the media in recent years, and that at a certain point people will say, okay, we had to fix what was broken, maybe like in our justice system, for example, which is what we see our justice minister trying hard to do right now, is, change, to put it diplomatically, the justice system. But do you think at a certain point people will say, okay, we've exposed what's wrong, we don't like it, but we better keep these institutions strong anyway, even if we see some of the messy stuff behind it?
I absolutely agree, and
I'm asking. I don't know if
I think we'd better do that. And I think that in a way, political attacks towards the media in Israel, I think were just the beginning of a major attack on other law enforcement institutions as well. Think about what is going on now between the political system and the police, not to talk about the justice system generally. So it seems that every institution that kind of threatens the ability of Netanyahu to remain strong finds itself under attack. It's not only the media. Also, I think that the public starts to understand that even though some of Netanyahu's criticism on traditional media was totally justified, there is some kind of, let's say, an agent problem here. Okay, we've exposed deficiencies of the media market, but now what? The question is whether do we remain, let's say, in the victim position and continue attacking personal investigative journalists, or we are going to say, no, we can fix that. We can, adopt better ethic rules. I don't know if we want to talk about it, but I was heading the team who wrote the ethical code for the Public Broadcasting Authority. I've just finished writing another code of ethics for the financial newspaper Globes. And I hope that those two codes would be some kind of a benchmark for the rest of...
Is it a new thing, a code of ethics for newspapers, for public broadcasters in Israel?
No.
Did you rely on previous versions of...
So there was was this mythological code of ethics for the public broadcasting in Israel, except that together with what was going on with public broadcasting generally, it kind of grew bigger and bigger, more and more political. So when the new body was founded, they approached me and asked me to write a new code of ethics. And this one is much thinner to begin with, but it emphasizes much more transparency over objectivity. We also spoke about, let's say, digital world, which was not referred to in the previous codes. For instance, the duty of every journalist to keep his information private, even, to put his cell phone with the right side up and down. We spoke about presenting statistical data, for instance, in a way that would be more, I would say,
accessible,
honest and accessible. We spoke about the question of a journalist who holds a private social media account and its relationship with the general body. So all those questions were, I think, questions that were important in terms of creating this ethos, because eventually this is what a media outlet has.
I agree with you. I think it's very interesting, but I think that we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves as experts and people who are interested in this than the general public. And if we're trusting that the general public is going to follow all these nice developments about codes of ethics and say, okay, we're fixing the press, now can we get back to the criticism of the prime minister? I don't think they're there. I mean, don't you think the debate in Israel is still, you're either with him or against him. If you're with the press, you're against him. And a lot of people say, he maybe did some silly little things, but the press is just out to get them. And that allows them to dismiss all the charges against him.
Well, I agree. I think this is the main danger that Israeli traditional media experience today. And I think that if they don't, or we as a public don't gather in order to stop that, we're going to be in a serious problem democratically. We can be cynical about it. Absolutely.
I'm not trying to be cynical. I'm really asking a question.
No, I know. But I'm just saying we can be cynical about it and say, that we can't fix it. It's going to be like that. Netanyahu is anyway manipulating traditional media by using his social media account. But eventually think about what we have seen all around the world with regard to fake news and to what social media actually causes to democracy and to polarization that you have mentioned before. And the fact that fake news always penetrates deeper into the network than real truth. All those issues are starting to be a major source of concern all around the world. It is going to be the same thing, I think, in Israel. Netanyahu is not going to be here forever. And I think our duty, or at least...
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't bet on that. Yeah.
No, so I'm just saying, I think my duty as a, I would say, public intellectual is to try to offer the solutions. It's not just to point, the deficiencies.
But do you feel, about the Israeli media specifically, do you believe in its resilience, in its robustness? Do you think that they would be able eventually to weather that storm? Or do you think that Netanyahu and the other people around him who are trying systematically to impair the media would have the way in one or another?
We're talking about multiple storms here. First of all is the financial storm. I think that's even worse than the political pressure that is being forced upon Israeli media. In this sense, I think the need, for instance, for legislation in Israel in order to make sure that the big platforms, which take bigger and bigger pieces of Israeli commercial budgeting, they need, let's say, to pay taxes in Israel, for instance, or to compensate traditional media in one way or another. It doesn't need to be giving compensation to specific media outlets, but for instance, opened up a fund that you've mentioned before in order to invest in original Israeli production. We can talk about things like that. Also, media regulation in Israel is very, very heavy. It also first creates a lot of political pressure, but also creates a lot of burden on the competitors' shoulders. So those things need to be addressed. Those issues need to be addressed. I think another thing is the fact that the Israeli public start to understand that the political pressure that is being forced upon the media by politicians, sometimes by, I would say, the back chairs politicians who are just trying to grab some, little bit of attention, it is not good for Israeli society, not good for Israeli governance. So in this sense, I think it has to stop. It has to get back into balance. sense.
Well, this is interesting because, we're talking about these very hyper-modern problems or postmodern problems of the Israeli media, but let's talk about one of the more archaic problems, and I think we're going to have to wrap up soon, but I think we can't really discuss the freedom of the Israeli media without discussing one of its oldest constraints, and that's the military censor. And you have called to abolish the military censor. What is this institution? Why do we need it or not need it?
Okay, so the military censorship in Israel was founded in 1947. But the Israeli government was also only started working at 48. This is because this is something we've inherited from the British mandate. So it's as democratic as the British mandate is a democracy. It's really interesting because it has never been cancelled in Israel. The military censorship is actually a unit within the Israeli army, which has enormous authorities to ask anyone who publishes anything in Israel, from books to newspapers to WhatsApp groups, to blogs, even WhatsApp groups, to present everything that they want to publish prior to publishing to the military censorship. One has to admit that the Supreme Court was quite harsh on the military censorship since the 80s, and they wouldn't let them censor too much information. That's why the military censorship has learned to use its little biting brothers, which are the gag orders in Israel. But again, to get a gag order, you need a judge. So maybe it's a little bit better than doing it within the Israeli army. Once I thought that the digital age would kind of make it, unnecessary and redundant, just like this British king who tried to tell the ocean waves to stop moving. But I can tell you honestly that the military censorship in Israel has learned to work with all new media outlets. It works with big WhatsApp groups, Facebook. They're monitoring social media in Israel, so they kind of know everything. In this sense, I think the situation today is even more severe than it was before the internet
Wait, they
age.
work with Facebook? What do you mean? Somebody has to submit? I mean, they can call for a post to be taken down from a private individual on Facebook?
They do that.
It's been done?
Yes, it's been done.
Wow.
It's been done. It was kind of embarrassing at the beginning because the current military censor sent private messages to people to tell them that they need to submit all different kind of materials, and those people told her, what are you talking about? This is an international platform. But it works. It's not that it's easy, and the virality of information online sometimes makes it more difficult for them to work, but they're definitely on it. No one should have any kind of doubt about that.
But do you think that its impact has been considerable? Do you think that without the military censorship, our knowledge of our world would have been considerably larger? Are we missing out on a lot?
And let me ask you about a particular case, because, there's one case I think is emblematic of the attempt to constrain that information, and that's Prisoner X. But we know about Prisoner X. We don't know the full story still, I think.
We learned about Prisoner X
about
3 years after, real time.
But we may never have known about it at all.
It's a huge time
and by then he was dead.
Yeah, I think we should say to our listeners what Prisoner X is.
Yeah, you can tell the story.
So Prisoner X was a prisoner at one of the Israeli jails who committed suicide in jail. It happened to be that he worked for one of the secret agencies in Israel, and nobody really knew why he committed suicide.
Or even why he was in jail.
Yes, and apparently he committed suicide because he was jailed for being a double agent. Sometimes this is generally what we know about this story, but what is interesting for us is that this whole story was revealed by Australian television, and the reason for that was that he was an Australian citizen.
And it was under heavy gag order, and if I'm not mistaken, double gag order.
Yeah.
In Israel.
The double gag order means that there was a gag order and then a gag order on the fact that there is a gag order. So one has to admit that it took, even in the internet age, and we thought that we can get all the knowledge that we want, it took a good couple of years until the story was out. On the other hand, other stories were usually published by international media outlets in London or in other outlets, and that's why it was not as, I would say, severe in terms of freedom of the press. But again, if you don't read English, if you're an Israeli citizen who doesn't read English, then you really don't know. If you're someone who doesn't really know how to conduct a proper search on Google, like a deeper search on Google, you wouldn't know.
But this Australian report was immediately picked up by Israeli outlets.
And then
this is
and then
exactly
immediately
how
taken
it is.
down.
This is exactly how it used to happen. Israeli media outlets used to say the Times in London tells us that this and this
that we
happened.
have a bomb.
Yes, that we have a bomb. Then this
that we
and
have a
that
nuclear
happened.
spy.
I think generally in terms of military censorship, it's not because of the internet that this needs to be abolished. It's because of democracy. And my suggestion is that they would abolish military censorship and open up an advisory body where newspapers can actually go and ask for an advice. Once they were told that they can publish everything, they can never be persecuted or they can never be charged for telling any kind of government secrets. That would be a much better, I would say, system in order to cope with the fact that after all, there are some secrets that we don't want to be out there. It's the lives of our children. But it needs to be much more balanced than it is today.
And until then, I think
we have a long way to go.
No, I think we'll have to submit a transcript of this podcast to the military censor. Yeah. And on this note, Dr. Tehilla Shwartz Altshuler of the Israel Democracy Institute, thank you very much for joining us today.
I had a wonderful time.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Julia Brahms and Itai Shelem, our producers, and the Israel Democracy Institute for their generous support. And now we have a request. Most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. And we would like to ask you this. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review. And then write one. Check out our archive with more than 450 interviews. If you like us, you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast. And follow me and Dahlia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.